Okay. Gather round, my young ones, for I want to talk to you about how warfare was conducted back in ancient times, when CRTs were simple and counters were one-sided. How our forefathers used to play. Well, how some of us used to play. All right. So yeah, for its era, this is actually a simplistic game already. However, and I'm just talking Strategos here, not the Imperial Governors. We'll handle that separately, I think, next. This does manage to provide something that is at the very least an interesting puzzle, or maybe an interesting chess-like design. I can't decide yet which this is. Is this just a puzzle game, in which case, somebody's got the advantage and somebody else is going to lose, and if people get to a certain level of play, it's pre-decided? I haven't played enough to be able to tell you that. It kind of feels like it might be. If it's not, if it truly is fairly balanced, and it doesn't have to be, 50-50, but say it's 60-40 or better, then I would say it kind of fits into that chess-like category, where each of your moves is really more about positioning and what your future moves might look like than I'm used to in most war games. Unlike the Avalon Hill Classics, though, this one manages to do something that I kind of like. That positioning isn't a matter of I can count on 6 hexes. I mean, there's some of that in this, but you don't feel yourself constantly counting your hexes and trying to pull the other guy and maybe catch him in the corner, as it were, as I put it in Go terms. Mugging someone in the corner, which is basically getting them to make some kind of horrible mistake that, puts their whole possibility of victory in jeopardy, just because your line has an apparent defect in it, but in order to take advantage of it, they have to position themselves in a way that, gives you this counter move that can crush them. On the other hand, in some of those Avalon Hill Classics, if you don't design your line perfectly, it'll break. It's very likely to break, and so you're constantly making these kind of numerical comparisons between the forces that you see of your opponent and your own forces, as well as which hexes each unit can reach, and it just becomes this horrible, horrible optimization problem. This doesn't manage that, in part because it's got hidden force composition. Although, I think for the most part, force composition isn't as hidden as the rules seem to imply, which is to say, if you've got people who aren't like me, who kind of can manage to, play in one setting, and yeah, this is a hell of a game to play in one sitting, but who can play for more than, a couple months at once. This is a game that you will very quickly have a fair idea of what your forces are, and where you hit your discriminators on the odds table. They can be a big difference, between the 125 and the 150. So one strength point could make a damn bit of difference here, but it's not a huge difference. It's not like, in some cases, the 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 charts that one strength point difference can make a huge, huge difference to. Here it's more incremental in flavor. It's still a big deal, but it's not the same kind of thing where it's like, well, I am completely invulnerable if I reach 3-to-1, but I could lose, my force if I'm attacking a 2-to-1. Yeah, that doesn't happen here. Like I said, the system is very, very simple. I'll take a look at the rules in a moment. But the map has an interesting facet to it. These Army and Navy points here. It's not all that pretty. It's sturdy material, though. The Army and Navy points serve a purpose that works similar to Empires and Arms, and since I haven't covered that, Europa Universalis is distinguishment between money and manpower in terms of more of the Empires and Arms side of things, in terms of what you can buy. Except here it's just this clear division. You have points that go for boats, and you have points that go for armies. I believe that gets taken away when you get to Imperial Governors, and it's one of the things that weakens the game, because here the different locations have a very different flavor to them. Just as, certain high-income locations in Empires and Arms are great if you have a navy or if you have an excess of manpower elsewhere, but are not terribly valuable in and of themselves in terms of building an army. So it gives you a little bit more grounding onto some kind of reality than many of these games tend to do. Certainly more than Imperium Romanum, with its very, very detailed monetary system would. But Imperium Romanum has something else in play, which is the manpower pools that are per location, basically. But per province. So that kind of gives that game its own little way of not just being conquest of the empire, right? Which was, aside from its flaws, which was very silly. It felt like some of the generic science fiction and fantasy games do. It was a generic historical game. The other components, oh man, these are hideous. They're so thin and so glossy and side-mounted, and there's so much wrong with them. That's life. What else is there? Well, not much, to tell you the truth. There's the rule book. The cards are not used in this one. The box is a box, right? It's a weak box. Okay. So what works? Let's look at the interesting things in the rules. One of the most interesting things is the command and control limitation by only having 4 generals on a side. That means that you cannot possibly commit all over the map and do things all over. And how much does that matter? I don't know, but it keeps the scale of individual campaigning areas kind of tight. And then you find yourself also in positions where one of your commanders is out of position from where you want him to be, and then it's going to be a significant effort to get him into position to where you can build the troops that you need to, etc. So you have to think hard. Is it worth, sending him off to go start building up an army somewhere that you need him, or can you just kind of ignore that and try to find an advantage somewhere else that you can use? Because the opportunity cost might be so high that moving him is actually just not even worthwhile. What else do we have? We have very, very ugly terrain to move through, not just in terms of looks, but in terms of that's 1 hex per turn. That keeps you very much channeled, usually along the coastal regions or in the Peloponnesus. It's difficult to operate in the hinterlands, basically. There's kind of an interesting reflection duality where you have over here in the Eastern Mediterranean, the capability to reach things by sea gives Athens a lot more mobility, whereas when you come over to the more western side of the Peloponnesian and elsewhere, it's actually easier to move things around by land, simply because Greece kind of juts out and it prevents boats from getting anywhere easily, and the fact that they have the same movement rate. How reasonable is that? It's not terribly unreasonable, to tell you the truth, especially in the month-long scale, because you're not going to be sailing or marching probably for a month straight. Um, the special rules for places like Sicily and Persia, they had a little bit of an exciting flavor and a kind of a push your luck type of thing in them, especially with Persia. With Persia, you know you will lose eventually if you go to. So it's usually a bad gambit, but Sicily, if you feel like you're slightly behind, it might be worth the risk to go for it. And it's always tempting because it has a big income. It's a 5-5 income. There isn't a lot. Well, there's nothing that's like that. Even Athens and Sparta are smaller than Sicily in terms of total income. Of course, if you do take them, unlike Athens and Sparta, they can be taken. And that's one of the key things in the game is in order to maintain that long static war, you had to have a special rule in this game on top of that really simple system, which is basically, you move into an area or into a hex, or into a region, and the hex is in a region. If you move into a city location and you match that city, it just becomes yours, but you have to stop and wait the turn there. If there's troops there, though, you have to fight them, and the city adds its value to the defense of the troops, which means you use a very interesting combat results table. This combat results table, why is it so interesting? Well, it's so interesting because, let's repeat what we asked. I really hate that habit, I'm sorry, and it's probably good communications and all, you hear people always doing it, but, drive the point home and all. You either fail or you wipe the enemy out. And if you wipe the enemy out, the question is, how bad did it hurt you? And most of the time, most of the battles you'll fight will be, like one of the enemy's strength points in a city, which might, quadruple the size of his force, against a fairly large force. So there's a good chance that fairly large force could take a pretty big hit. And that adds the interest and the excitement to the game and the possible variability here. So this chart actually injects a good deal of variable results into the game, possibly at key moments, where either you can stall or get hurt really badly or break through very easily. All of these things are possible at different odds levels. But you're constantly being given these choices. So it's kind of more similar to games like, an OCS type game or something where you're fighting a huge number of battles over the course of the game, so that it's not all coming down to one die roll, even though some die rolls mean more than others, it turns out, based on your strategy, though. And the fact that nulls happen quite often means that you might get multiple chances and chances to bring reserves into play, etc. How is this different from Imperium Romanum, which is on a similar type of concept and period? Well, the Imperium Romanum has the unfortunate requirement that you attack, or else you will degrade. You'll just start collapsing. Which means you have to, quite often you find yourself in a situation where you're saying, well, I'm a little behind the enemy, but I might as well attack him with my full force against his full force. And that just becomes the game. Full force against full force may do nothing in this. Close battles don't happen. You can't even fight if you don't have 125% of the opponent's strength, which means, and that may be a weird design for effect type thing, but what it means is you don't have that, yep, I'll take a shot at it. Instead, what you have is, well, can I afford to lose 25% of my force taking out his whole force? Obviously. Can I afford to lose 25% of my force picking off a town with a small garrison? Well, maybe not. That is the kind of thinking that you have, and it ends up just very, very different from the Imperium Romanum field, where basically you're just trying to get to the enemy and get that battle done with. And then, oh look, the game's over, basically. Instead, with this one, you're constantly fighting battles over positioning and territory, and it's just a much, much more interesting gameplay. Certainly can't be any less historical than what I've seen in Imperium Romanum either. So, even if the design for effect things seem less historical than that detailed, try to capture a lot of elements of the economy, etc. That's in IR2. Net effect for this feels a little better, even though there might be some things that you'll look at and say, well, that's just totally bogus. The game is designed for the war that it's in, and reasonably well within that. The ability to hoard money might seem a little weird. To hoard capacity to produce fleets and hoard capacity to produce armies. But there are limitations. You can't overbuild in any one space. You're only allowed to build the number of units that space actually generates revenue that would support in any one turn, which kind of makes sense. Special rule on the Athenian harvest. Unlike historically, I found that this was seldom worth using. Basically, if Sparta's got an army active near Athens, it's almost certainly worth grabbing just for the cash. But if they can't afford to keep an army operating near Athens, which they probably need anyway, or if they can't afford the leader, which was the case as we got later in the game and Sparta was starting to win, they just couldn't afford to keep anything on that front. It definitely became less, or they didn't, the leaders were really the effect. It became not a terribly important thing in the game. It wasn't hurting Athens, it only helped Sparta. So it has less of an effect than it does in some other designs. For example, Pericles, where we saw that rating being very important for what? I think it was just the honor. And that's really about it, to tell you the truth. I mean, it really is a simple package. I can't tell you for sure what it's providing you. For me, it's still at that stage that I can't crack the game and say, I have a definite feeling that this is unbalanced, or I have a definite feeling, that it is fairly balanced, and thus it's interesting. Unlike most chess-like games, I feel like the decisions here are at that broad level that I kind of like that come from more detail. So, like I mentioned, the OCS, I feel like I'm making the same kind of decisions that I make in OCS in terms of, yes, I want to throw the majority of my strength in this direction, and I'll gain this. The especially interesting thing about this one is that moving around and trying to deprive your opponent of his production, and or try to increase your own, or keep your own production at about what you got in those first two turns. Remember this? If you remember, the first two turns of the game are these special, first 2 years of the game, or year representations, are these special turns that allow you to expand without being at war with the enemy. So you get to set yourself up and have a good-sized coalition to take against each other. Without that, you would have to preset the coalitions or something. You couldn't, and that would be a decent option too, but I don't mind the fact that it plays out in this kind of pregame thing. Overall, I am, it's not like, oh my God, this is just such a fantastic game, but it's a pleasant surprise given what it looks like, given not just component quality, which certainly could be meaningless. But you look at the rules and you read through them and you're like, not a lot of game there, right? Yeah, there actually is. It's more of the complexity is more of an emergent type of situation where it's the strategies that create the complexity, and it, kind of like Go has, where not a lot of rules there, but man, you can really, you can really kind of sink your teeth into the game. I feel like you kind of can with this. And while it would be a disappointment to find out after, say, 3 to 5 playings that, yep, Sparta always wins, the trip there wouldn't be, So I think I think the package was well worth it for its time, just based on Strategos. And my impression of Imperial Governors is so poor right now that that's what you'd have to go on. And we'll see what I look at with it. Because again, maybe it'll surprise me, but I think it was the one that excited me more, and I couldn't get, because I had it before Imperial Romanum, and I couldn't get any traction on it really within my own head. It made me very excited about Imperial Romanum, but yeah, no. Not over the time. In terms of trying to hunt this thing down, I don't think it's a big collector's item, but it's hard to find. So you could probably get a hold of a copy of it for not an unreasonable price, kind of like the Hannibal and I don't remember what else it was. I can't remember. The Hannibal I'm talking about being the Ulrich Council or whatever one. Again, a kind of an oddity. It was the French and Indian War one, but Mohawk. Unlike those two, or similar to those two, I think you could probably find this for not a ridiculously high price given how fairly rare it is. And it might be worth it. On the other hand, there are a lot of games out there, I think this is a neat puzzle. I haven't seen anything of quite this flavor. You know what it reminds me the most of is my misplaying of Warp War. Just because I had the feeling of, you may never be able to win. Well, I think eventually luck will... There's either an imbalance or luck will fall heavily enough on one side or another to create an imbalance. Is it just luck? No. I mean, that luck's not going to matter if you don't have a strategy behind it. The strategy's not at the level of Go, though. It's a fairly simple game, and it really comes to trying to make the most of some fairly simple choices that you have. It doesn't try to obfuscate anything, though. It's all right there in front of you. You can see, well, we're going to be playing Ring Around the Rosie unless I do something here, right? It's all very obvious, very clear. Hexes pretty much cost 1 movement point each to move through. There's no weird, areas of boxes connected by little lines. And yes, I'm hacking a little bit on Pericles, but honestly, I'm hacking on all point-to-point systems, because they just don't translate to being able to kind of immediately grasp the world. You have to practice and play with them a lot to kind of understand what the world actually looks like that you're looking at, and that's very troublesome. Each one is different. So, each time you play a point-to-point game, you're kind of like, if you really like the idea of being presented with new puzzles, well, they're presenting you a new puzzle to even understand the game state at any given time. With this, the game state's very easy to understand, and there's still interesting problems there. Whether or not there's interesting, I know there's interesting problems in Pericles, but in some of these point-to-point games, I'm not sure there's any damn interesting problem beyond trying to figure out what the game state is. So, I don't know. Not not the biggest ones, but it is this extra layer, and it's kind of the same kind of layer that's in there with modern Euros, with trying to figure out solo games that have like a bot or something like that. It's kind of like, well, I don't understand the full representation of the information that I have available to me to make decisions on, and they're trying to hide that information for whatever reason. In some cases, with point-to-point systems, they're trying to hide it because it's a good way to represent the information without a lot of hex counting, without a lot of old-fashioned-y seeming things, but it still hides the information. With some other games, they're trying to hide the information because that's the only thing that there's of interest to to the game. That's how you figure out the game. You figure out how to figure out the game state, and then it becomes obvious what to do. Difference between the better and worse sides of that line. But anyway, this one's pretty decent. Much better than I would have thought from reading just the rules.